Poor twins hand a box to a billionaire CEO, and they say, "We found this in our mum's room, and it has your picture." He is stunned and starts to cry. The house remains silent, the kind of silence that only exists after someone important leaves forever. Leah and Ben, little twins with dark hair and curious eyes, stepped into the room that had belonged to their mother. The door creaked slightly, as if protesting the intrusion. "Do you think Grandma will be mad if she catches us here?" Ben whispered, gripping his sister's hand tightly. Leah shook her head. "She's sleeping. Besides, Mom wouldn't mind." The room had remained almost untouched since Sarah passed away 3 months earlier. Mrs. Grace, the children's grandmother, hadn't had the heart to change anything. The soft scent of perfume still hung in the air, the books on the shelf, the stopped clock, as if time inside that room had frozen. "Why did we come here again?" Ben asked, looking around with a mixture of sadness and curiosity. "Because I miss her," Leah answered simply. "And because I wanted to show you what I found." From her school uniform bag, Leah took out a small golden key. "Where did you get that?" Ben's eyes went wide. "It was at the bottom of the kitchen drawer. Grandma never goes there." Leah's eyes shone with determination. "And I think I know where it fits." The girl walked over to the wardrobe and pointed to a wooden box on the highest shelf. Ben dragged a chair and climbed up. Carefully, he took down the box and got off the chair. It was a beautiful piece, with carved details and a small lock. The children sat on the floor, the box between them like a newly discovered treasure. "Try the key," Ben whispered, as though any sound might break the magic of the moment. Leah gently inserted the key. The click of the lock sounded like thunder in the silence of the room. Both held their breath and opened the lid together. Inside were old letters, some ribbons, a delicate handkerchief, and at the bottom, a photograph. Leah picked it up carefully. "Look, it's Mom," Ben exclaimed. The photo showed Sarah, young and smiling, next to a tall man neither of them recognized. It wasn't their father. According to Mrs. Grace, he had disappeared before they were even born. This man looked important, wearing a well-tailored suit and displaying a reserved, almost shy smile beside their mother. "Who is he?" Ben asked, touching the stranger's face with the tip of his finger. Leah turned the photo over. On the back, a handwritten dedication read, "Forever in the moments that matter. With love, Jay." "Jay?" Ben frowned. "Who's Jay?" The silence in the room felt different now. It was no longer the silence of absence, but of discovery. Suddenly, the story they knew, the story of a single mother raising 2 kids alone until she fell ill, gained a shadow, a mystery. "Maybe he was someone Mom cared about," Leah suggested, running her finger over the written words. "Or maybe—" Ben didn't finish the sentence, but Leah knew what he was thinking. They both shared that hope only kids who grew up without a father nurture. That there was someone, somewhere, who could fill that empty space. They heard footsteps in the hall and quickly put everything back into the box, except for the photo. Leah hid it in her pocket as the door opened. Mrs. Grace appeared, wearing her grey robe and with her greying hair tied in a bun. "What are you two doing here? It's past your bedtime," she said, unable to hide her surprise at finding them in her daughter's room. "We miss Mom," Ben replied honestly. Mrs. Grace's gaze softened. "I miss her too, dear. Every single day." She sat at the edge of the bed and opened her arms. The children approached and received her warm hug. "Grandma," Leah began hesitantly, "did Mom have a lot of friends?" The question took Mrs. Grace by surprise. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Leah lied, feeling the weight of the photo in her pocket. "Your mom was reserved," Mrs. Grace replied thoughtfully. "She had few friends, but they were very loyal." Ben couldn't contain himself. "Did she know someone whose name starts with J?" Mrs. Grace's face hardened for a moment, so quickly the children barely noticed. "I don't recall anyone important. Now off to bed. You have school tomorrow." Safely back in the shared bedroom under the dim light of the lamp, the twins examined the photo again. "Grandma is hiding something," Leah murmured. "How are we going to find out who he is?" Ben asked. Leah thought for a moment. "Mr. Peterson." "The neighbor?" "Yes. He works with computers." Maybe he can help us figure out who the man in the photo is. The next morning, under the pretext of playing in the yard, the twins slipped away to Mr. Peterson's house. The middle-aged man with a gentle smile welcomed them with cookies and juice. "What can I do for you two today?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. Leah pulled the photo from her pocket and explained their mission. Mr. Peterson examined the image carefully. "Let's see. I can enlarge it on my computer and maybe find something." After a few minutes of typing and clicking, Mr. Peterson stopped and looked at the children in astonishment. "Do you two know who this man is?" They both shook their heads in the negative. "That's Jack Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, one of the biggest companies in the country." The children exchanged confused glances. What would their mother be doing with someone so important? "Are you sure?" Leah asked. Mr. Peterson turned the screen to them. There was the same man, a few years older, in an article about the 50 most influential business leaders. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," they said in unison, running back home. Mrs. Grace was on the porch when they arrived, breathless and excited. Before they could filter their thoughts, Ben blurted, "Grandma, who is Jack Whitmore?" The juice Mrs. Grace was drinking almost slipped from her hands. "Where did you hear that name?" With no choice, Leah showed her the photo. Mrs. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, as if recalling something painful. "Come inside. We need to talk." In the living room, Mrs. Grace examined the picture for a long time. Finally, she spoke in a controlled voice. "Jack Whitmore was a special friend of your mother's before you two were born." "Why have we never heard of him?" Leah asked. "Not everything in adult life makes sense, dear. Some stories don't have a happy ending." "Is he alive?" Ben wanted to know. "Yes, very much alive and very rich. He runs one of the largest companies in this country. Can we meet him?" The words slipped out of Leah's mouth before she could stop them. Mrs. Grace hesitated. Her first instinct was to deny, to protect the children from possible rejection, but something in the determined look of her grandchildren, so much like Sarah's, made her change her mind. Maybe that's a good thing," she murmured, more to herself. "Maybe it's time for some secrets to come out." She took a deep breath and held the children's hands. "All right, I'll take you to Jack Whitmore." The twins' eyes shone with a mix of fear and hope. The photo in the box had opened a door to an unknown past, and now they were about to step through it. The Whitmore Enterprises building loomed against the clear morning sky, a tower of glass and steel that reflected the clouds and the sun, like a giant watching over the city. Mrs. Grace held Leah and Ben's hands firmly as they approached the main entrance. "Remember what we agreed," she said quietly. "I'll leave you here and watch from a distance. If anything goes wrong, I'll come right away." Leah clutched the small wooden box to her chest. Ever since they had discovered the photo, she could barely sleep. Something inside her said this meeting would change everything. "Will he talk to us?" Ben whispered to Leah as Mrs. Grace guided them through the busy sidewalk. "He has to," his sister replied determinedly. "And we came so far." Mrs. Grace led them to a strategic spot near the main entrance. She knelt in front of her grandchildren, adjusting their clothes with slightly trembling hands. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her face creased with worry. "We can still go back home." "We're sure, Grandma," Leah answered, her determination unwavering. "We want to meet him," Ben added. "We need to know who he is." Mrs. Grace sighed deeply. She had never wanted this moment, but she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. Maybe Sarah had been right. The children had the right to know. "Wait here," she instructed, pointing to a space near the revolving doors. "I'll be watching from that cafe across the street. If you need me, just wave." The twins nodded, suddenly serious with responsibility. Mrs. Grace kissed their foreheads and reluctantly stepped away, crossing the street toward the small cafe with sidewalk tables. Alone now, Ben and Leah looked at each other. "Now what?" Ben asked. "Now we wait," Leah replied. "Mr. Peterson said he usually leaves around 5 for off-site meetings." They positioned themselves near the entrance, trying to look like they were waiting for someone. The hours passed slowly. Across the street, Mrs. Grace kept watch, pretending to read a book but rarely taking her eyes off her grandchildren. The sun was already starting to dip toward the horizon when activity in the lobby increased. Groups of executives emerged, some getting into waiting cars, others heading off on foot to late-day engagements. "Look," Ben nudged his sister. "That's him." Jack Whitmore walked out of the building, surrounded by a few aides. He looked exactly like in the photo, just older. Grey at the temples, deeper lines on his face, the same commanding posture. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and carried a black leather briefcase. The twins froze for a moment, the reality of the moment suddenly overwhelming. Across the street, Mrs. Gray stood, tense, ready to intervene if needed. "Let's go," Leah whispered, regaining her courage. She took her brother's hand and they stepped forward. Jack's aides noticed them first, two small children approaching their boss with determined expressions. One of them moved slightly, as if to intercept, but it was too late. "Mr. Whitmore," Leah called out, her voice louder than she intended. Jack stopped, surprised, and turned around. His initially confused gaze landed on the children now standing in front of him. "Can I help you?" he asked politely but distantly. The aides exchanged uncertain looks, not sure how to proceed. Jack made a subtle gesture dismissing them. Reluctantly, they took a few steps back, still watching. Leah took a deep breath. The speech she had rehearsed vanished from her mind. Instead, she simply held out the wooden box with both hands. "We found this in our mum's room," she said, the words spilling out in a rush. "And it has your picture." Jack looked at the wooden box, and something extraordinary happened. His face, normally composed and controlled, completely changed. The mere sight of that box, even before touching it or opening it, triggered a reaction no one who knew him had ever witnessed. His eyes widened in immediate recognition, his hands began to tremble, and then, without warning, tears sprang into his eyes, 1, 2, and soon they were rolling freely down his face. "This box," he whispered, his voice unrecognizable. With shaking hands, he took the object from Leah. His fingers ran over the carved wood as though he were touching a precious treasure, a sacred relic long lost. "Sarah," he murmured, before even opening the box or seeing the photo. The name escaped his lips like a prayer. His aides exchanged alarmed glances. In all their years working for Jack Whitmore, none had ever seen him shed a single tear. And now, in the middle of the sidewalk, in front of two unknown children, the powerful CEO openly wept. "Where did you come from?" he asked between sobs. "Who is your mother?" "Sarah," Ben replied. "Sarah Williams." The name, confirming his suspicion, struck Jack like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, as if his legs could no longer support him. More tears followed, unstoppable now. With fingers that barely felt like his own, he finally opened the box. There was the photograph, him and Sarah, young and smiling, in what felt like another lifetime. The dedication he himself had written on the back was slightly faded. "Forever in the moments that matter. With love, Jay." Across the street, Mrs. Grace watched intently, her book forgotten on the table, her hands gripping her purse tightly. She could only see Jack's back, but she noticed how his shoulders shook with quiet sobs. "She's gone, isn't she?" he finally asked, his voice almost unrecognizable. Leah nodded, feeling her own tears forming. "It's been 3 months. Cancer." Jack closed his eyes tightly, as though the words physically hurt him. When he opened them again, his gaze swept over the twins from head to toe, truly seeing them for the first time. Now he noticed something familiar in the children's faces, something that made him look more closely, that stirred questions he wasn't ready to ask. One of his aides approached hesitantly, checking his watch. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the meeting with the Japanese board begins in 20 minutes. We can't be late." Still holding the box, Jack seemed torn between two worlds, the present, with its unyielding commitments, and the past, suddenly returning to haunt him. For a brief moment, he appeared vulnerable, exposed. Then, as if something inside him shut down, his expression changed. The professional mask slid back into place, a shield against the emotion threatening to consume him. He wiped the tears quickly with the back of his hand and straightened his posture. "I have to go," he said, his voice now controlled, almost cold compared to his previous reaction. He closed the box carefully and handed it back to Leah without another word. The contrast was shocking. In seconds, the emotional, vulnerable man had disappeared, replaced by the distant, inaccessible executive. "Thank you for showing me this," he added formally, as though thanking them for the delivery of a mundane package rather than a glimpse of a lost life. "I have to leave now." Without further explanation, without any promise of future contact, Jack turned and walked to the waiting limousine. His aides exchanged confused looks but followed in silence, relieved to return to the familiar territory of business and schedules. Ben and Leah stood rooted to the spot, watching the abrupt transformation with bewildered eyes. The hope they had nourished, for answers, for a connection, for some sort of resolution, deflated in the face of his sudden farewell. As the limousine pulled away, Mrs. Grace crossed the street and approached the twins. She didn't ask anything, she just hugged them. In the silence of that embrace, they all felt the weight of disappointment. "He cried, Grandma," Ben said finally, his voice small and confused. But then it was like he turned into someone else. Mrs. Grace looked in the direction where the limousine had disappeared. "Some men hide behind walls they build themselves," she murmured, squeezing her grandchildren's shoulders, "and they end up prisoners within those walls." Leah looked at the box in her hands, the same box that had made a powerful man break down in tears just moments before. "Will he come back?" she asked, her voice betraying the doubt she felt. Mrs. Grace didn't answer. She just took the twins' hands and led them back to the hotel. Night fell over the city, enveloping the three in elongated shadows, while Leah's question hung in the air, unanswered. Jack's apartment occupied the top floor of a building in the city's financial center. Spacious, minimalist, decorated in shades of grey and black that reflected the absence of chaos, of surprises, of life. Every object had its assigned place, every space its specific function. A controlled environment, like his own existence. He entered in silence, dismissing the housekeeper with an automatic gesture. He left his suit jacket on the sofa, a deviation from his usual routine of hanging it up immediately. The briefcase with important documents for the meeting he had just missed remained forgotten on the floor. Jack walked to the bar and poured himself a whiskey. 1 sip, 2. The amber liquid burned as it went down, but couldn't extinguish the suffocating feeling that had followed him since his encounter with the children. Children? Sarah's children. His children? The question lingered like smoke, inescapable. He took the wooden box from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table. That simple box had robbed him of his composure, his control, his carefully constructed mask. He had given it to Sarah on her first birthday they celebrated together. He remembered her smile when she opened it, how her eyes shone upon seeing the small piece of jewelry inside, a silver pendant that had cost 3 months' salary back then. "To keep our moments," he had said. "Our moments." Jack opened the box again. The pendant was gone. Only the photo and some yellowed clippings remained. He took the photograph, looking at the couple smiling at the camera. It felt like another life, another Jack. One who still knew how to smile without effort, who still allowed joy to reach his eyes. Sarah. Her golden hair shining in the sun, her green eyes overflowing with hope for the future. A future with him, a future he had destroyed with his own hands. He remembered how it all began to crumble, the unanswered calls, the messages replied to late, the last-minute cancelled dinners. Always work, always the company, always ambition. "It's only for now," he would say. "Until the company grows, until I get the promotion, until we close the contract. Until. The work never ended. There was always a new project, a new goal, another mountain to conquer. And Sarah, patient at first, grew increasingly distant. He saw the growing disappointment in her eyes but ignored it. He had learned early on that emotions were distractions, obstacles on the path to success. His father's voice echoed in his mind, as clear as if he stood there in the apartment. Weakness is the worst flaw in a man. Charles Whitmore, an old-school businessman, rigid as iron, cold as ice. A father who never hugged him, who never openly showed pride, who turned every achievement into just another rung on the endless ladder of expectations. Jack was 8 when his mother died. He remembered the funeral, the casket lowering into the ground, people crying around him, but not his father. Charles stood emotionless, a statue of control amid the collective grief. That night, Jack cried in his room, clutching a pillow to muffle his sobs. His father opened the door without knocking and found him like that, vulnerable, broken, human. "Dry those tears," he ordered, his voice slicing the air like a razor. "Men don't cry. Weakness is the worst flaw in a man. Remember that." And Jack remembered. He carried those words like a mantra through life. He buried emotions, stifled vulnerabilities, built tall, impenetrable walls around his heart. He became the image of his father, the 2.0 version of Charles Whitmore, more efficient, more successful, colder. That was the man Sarah met in college, already distant, already controlled, but with cracks where light seeped in. Cracks that she, with her easy laugh and genuine warmth, managed to widen. For a while, Jack allowed himself to feel. He allowed himself to love. But when the company began to grow, when responsibilities increased, old habits returned. The cracks closed one by one, until Sarah found herself facing an impenetrable wall. That was when she left. Jack did not beg her to stay. He didn't chase after her. He didn't try to fix what he had broken. After all, he had been trained for this, to endure losses without showing pain, to move on without looking back. He remembered their last conversation. Sarah, standing at the door with her bags packed, tears pooling in her eyes but not falling. "You chose a Jack," she said, "not me. You chose this emptiness, this loneliness." "I'm building a future for us," he replied, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "There won't be an us in that future you're building. There will only be you, at the top, alone." And she was right. 10 years later, there he was, at the top, alone. The owner of a business empire, respected and feared in the market, bank accounts that grew as steadily as his heart shrank. Jack poured himself another whiskey, feeling the weight of the memories on his shoulders. He recalled receiving a few letters from Sarah in the first months after their separation. Letters he never answered, convinced that silence was the dignified way to handle rejection. Now, holding that photo, he wondered, what if there was more in those unanswered letters? What if she had tried to tell him about the children? What if, all this time? The faces of the twins flashed in his mind. The boy with the curious gaze, the girl with the fierce determination. He had seen himself in them, in the shape of their eyes, in the line of their chins. And he had seen Sarah too, in the sparkle of their eyes, in the gentle curve of their lips. His children. The children he hadn't seen being born, hadn't watched grow, hadn't witnessed their first steps or heard their first words. 10 years of absence he could never get back. Jack felt a pressure in his chest, a physical pain that accompanied the emotional turmoil. For a moment, he considered calling the hotel the children had mentioned. He thought about seeking them out, trying to explain, begging forgiveness. But what would he say? How could he justify a decade of absence? How could he explain that he didn't know they existed because he was too cowardly to respond to Sarah's letters? How could he admit that, even if he had known, he might not have been capable of being the father they deserved? His father's voice echoed again. "Weakness is the worst flaw in a man." Jack closed his eyes, exhausted. The supposed strength that had sustained him for so many years now suffocated him. The walls he had built to protect himself had become his prison. The success he pursued relentlessly seemed hollow, measured against what he had lost. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to question the values that guided his life. He allowed himself to doubt his father's words ringing in his mind. "What if he's wrong?" he murmured into the empty apartment. "What if the real weakness is exactly this inability to feel, to love, to care?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Jack put the photo in his pocket, near his heart. Tomorrow would be another day. Tomorrow, maybe, he'd find the courage to face not only his unresolved past, but also the possibility of a different future, a future where, who knows, he might not be alone anymore. Jack's apartment occupied the top floor of a building in the city's financial center. Spacious, minimalist, decorated in shades of grey and black that reflected the absence of chaos, surprises, life. Every object had its place, every space its specific function, a controlled environment, like his own existence. The morning light flooded the apartment as he watched the city awaken through the panoramic window. He hadn't slept. His mind refused to rest, replaying the encounter with the children in a constant loop of questions without answers. Who were they, really? Why had they kept that photo, that box, for all these years? And why, despite all his emotional discipline, hadn't he been able to hold back tears when he saw it? Jack realized he knew nothing beyond their first names. Ben and Leah. They hadn't left an address or a last name, not even the full name of the grandmother who watched from afar. Only fragments, the wooden box, Sarah's photo, two children whose eyes, in some way, felt familiar. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," said Russell Carter, a former police officer who occasionally did discreet work for Jack. Wasn't expecting a call so early. "I need you to find some people for me," Jack said, direct as always. 2 children and their grandmother. The mother's name was Sarah Williams. She passed away about 3 months ago. "Any other information?" "They're small children. A boy and a girl. The grandmother is an older lady with grey hair. I don't have more details." There was a moment of silence. Russell never asked why Jack sought these people. He never asked questions. That was why Jack hired him. "I'll need a few days," the investigator replied. "Is there any specific urgency?" Jack hesitated. Why was he doing this? What right did he have to investigate these children just because they carried a photo of him? But something inside him, a restlessness he couldn't name, gave him no peace. "Just find them," he finally answered. "It's important." In the days that followed, Jack threw himself into work with renewed intensity, trying to drown out the whirlwind of emotions the encounter had stirred. He cancelled off-site meetings, preferring to stay in the office and away from the streets where he might run into them again unexpectedly. His employees noticed the change. The always composed and distant Jack Whitmore was replaced by an even more closed-off version of himself, almost fierce in his concentration. No one dared mention the incident with the kids on the sidewalk, though rumors circulated in the hallways. On Thursday, while Jack was reviewing contracts in his office, his secretary announced Russell Carter. Jack set aside the documents and signaled for the man to enter. "I found them," Russell said without preamble, placing a folder on the desk. It was harder than I expected. Jack opened the folder with slightly trembling fingers. Inside were photos, addresses, and basic information about the children and their grandmother. They live in a small community outside the city, Maple Creek, a quiet place, about a 40-minute drive from here. The photos showed a modest but well-kept house, a colorful front yard, and a wide porch. In one picture, the children played in the yard. "Benjamin and Olivia Williams," Russell continued, pointing to one of the documents. "They live with their grandmother, Grace Williams, since their mother's death. A simple house, a simple life, nothing extraordinary." Jack studied the children's photo. Something about them intrigued him, something beyond the connection to Sarah. He couldn't quite define it. "The grandmother, Grace Williams, is retired. She took legal custody of them after her daughter's death. Cancer, as you mentioned." Jack remained silent, absorbing every detail. "Would you like me to keep observing them?" Russell asked. "No," Jack responded quickly. "This is enough, thank you." Once Russell left, Jack stayed fixated on the photos. Now he knew where to find them. He had all the information he needed. But what would he do with it? The doubt consumed him for 2 more days. What would he say when he arrived? What explanation would he give for suddenly appearing? What right did he have to interfere in those children's lives just because they held a memory of Sarah? On Sunday morning, Jack made his decision. He dressed casually, a rarity for him, in dark pants and a blue shirt without a tie. He dismissed the driver and took his own car, a discreet sedan he rarely used. During the 40-minute drive to Maple Creek, his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter and tighter. Several times he considered turning back. What was he doing? What did he expect to find? The small town was exactly as the photos showed, quiet, with modest houses and well-tended gardens. Jack slowed down, following the GPS directions to the street where the Williams family lived. He parked at a safe distance and sat in the car for several minutes, watching the house. It was a sunny Sunday, and many families were enjoying the day in their yards. He saw Mrs. Grace tending flowers, wearing a straw hat to protect herself from the sun. The children were nowhere in sight. Jack took a deep breath. It was now or never. He left the car and walked slowly toward the house. His legs felt like they weighed a ton with every step. Mrs. Grace looked up from her flowers when she heard his approaching footsteps. Her face, marked by age and recent worries, hardened when she recognized him. There was no surprise in her eyes, only resigned acceptance, as if she had been expecting this moment for years. "Mr. Whitmore," she said simply, without offering her hand or a smile. "Mrs. Williams," Jack replied, feeling strangely nervous, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. "Forgive the intrusion." "The children found you," she said, not as a question but a statement. "Yes," Jack nodded. "They showed me a box. A photo." Mrs. Grace observed him in silence for a moment, as if assessing not just his words, but his character as a human being. "Come in," she said at last, removing her straw hat and gardening gloves. "We can talk on the porch." Jack followed her along the small stone path to the wide porch that wrapped around the front of the house. It was a simple space, with time-worn rocking chairs and potted plants hanging from the ceiling. A place where, Jack imagined, Sarah might have spent many afternoons in her childhood. "Have a seat, Mrs." Grace indicated one of the chairs, mon fils, without ceremony. "Would you like tea or something stronger?" "Tea would be great," Jack replied, grateful for the normalcy of the offer amid the strangeness of the situation. While Mrs. Grace went inside, Jack noticed two small figures watching him from the side window. The twins. Their expressions held a mixture of caution and fascination. When they realized he saw them, they withdrew quickly. Mrs. Grace returned a few minutes later with a tray containing 2 steaming cups of tea and some homemade cookies. She placed it on the small table between the chairs and sat, adjusting her simple dress with a habitual gesture. "So," she began, her voice neutral but firm, "what brings you here, Mr. Whitmore?" Jack hesitated. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? "The children," he finally said. "Our meeting was unexpected. I didn't know. Sarah never mentioned—" "Sarah mentioned you," Mrs. Grace interrupted, her eyes locked on his. "Not often. And usually not positively." Jack felt the weight of those words. Of course, Sarah would speak of him with bitterness. He deserved that. "She said you were a cold man," Mrs. Grace continued, pouring the tea with precise movements. "Someone who chose success and solitude when she needed companionship the most." Sarah never understood how anyone could be so blind to what really matters. Every word was like a needle, precise and painful, hitting the most vulnerable spots. Jack accepted the cup she offered, grateful to have something to occupy his trembling hands. I wasn't what she deserved," he admitted, surprising even himself with his honesty. "Mrs." Grace nodded slightly, as if receiving confirmation of something she already knew. "No, you weren't." Silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle creak of the rocking chairs and the distant chirping of birds. Jack sipped the tea, trying to gather his thoughts. "They're wonderful children," Mrs. Grace said at last, her tone softer. "Ben has Sarah's curiosity, always asking questions, always wanting to understand the world. And Leah has her determination, stubborn as a mule, but with a huge heart." Jack drank in every word as eagerly as he drank the tea. Details about the children, about what Sarah had passed on to them. "It must be hard," he commented, "raising them on your own." Mrs. Grace gave a small smile, the first since his arrival. "It's a challenge, yes. I don't have the energy I once had. But they are the light of my life, especially after Sarah." Her voice caught slightly. Jack felt a wave of guilt. While he built his business empire, Sarah had raised those children. She had laughed with them, cried with them, taught them values. And then she had gone, leaving them in her mother's care. What he wouldn't give for just one more day with her. to say he was sorry, to try to explain the inexplicable, how a man could be so blind, so foolish, so incapable of seeing what truly mattered. "Why are you here, Mr. Whitmore?" Mrs. Grace asked again, her voice gentle but persistent. "What do you hope to find?" Jack had no answer. What was he looking for? Redemption, connection, some fragment of Sarah to keep her memory alive? "I don't know," he answered truthfully. "When the kids showed me that photo, something changed inside me. I can't forget their faces." Mrs. Grace studied him for a long moment, as though she could see beyond his words, beyond his carefully maintained composure. "They're out back," she said finally. "If you'd like to see them." It was an invitation, but also a test. Jack nodded, grateful for the opportunity, yet apprehensive about what he'd say or how he'd act. Mrs. Grace led him through the simple but welcoming house. Jack noticed the family photos on the walls, Sarah at various ages, always smiling, the children from infancy up to the present, a family united by love and shared memories. In the backyard, Ben and Leah played under the shade of a large tree. Leah was on a tire swing, while Ben tried to build something with wooden blocks. When they saw Jack, they froze. Their gazes, wary, curious, hopeful, hit him with unexpected force. "Children," Mrs. Grace called softly. "Mr. Whitmore came to visit." Ben approached first, taking cautious but determined steps. "Did you come about the box?" he asked directly. Jack hesitated. How to explain to a child the storm of emotions that had brought him here? "I came because of you," he replied simply. "I wanted to know you better." Leah, still on the swing, watched with narrowed eyes, evaluating his every movement, every word. "Why?" she asked, her voice carrying a distrust no child should have. "Because you matter," Jack said, surprising himself with his sincerity. "Because you knew Sarah in a way I never did." The children exchanged glances, a silent conversation Jack couldn't decipher. "You can sit here," Ben finally offered, pointing to a bench under the tree. "I'm building a city." Jack accepted the invitation, sitting on the small wooden bench. He watched as Ben returned to his construction, his small fingers stacking blocks with intense concentration. Mrs. Grace stepped away discreetly, returning to the house, but Jack could feel her watchful gaze from the kitchen window. "Do you live in a big apartment?" Ben asked, not lifting his eyes from the city he was building. "Yes," Jack replied. "Downtown?" "Does it have a yard?" "No, just a balcony." Ben nodded, as though the answer confirmed something important. "Mom said yards are important, that people need to see things grow." Jack felt the weight of those simple words. It was something Sarah would say, something deep disguised as a casual remark. Leah finally approached, abandoning the swing. She sat on the grass, not too close, but close enough to be part of the conversation. "Were you and Mom friends?" she asked directly. "You and Sarah?" Jack hesitated again. What to say, how to sum up what was and what could have been in words a child could grasp. "We were more than friends," he answered carefully. "But that was a long time ago." "Why did you stop being friends?" Ben asked, accidentally knocking over a tower of blocks. The innocent question struck Jack like a physical blow. How to explain that he had destroyed everything, that it was his coldness, his blind ambition, his inability to cherish what mattered most? "Sometimes people go different ways," he replied vaguely. I made mistakes." Leah looked at him with an unsettling intensity for someone so young. "Grandma says everyone makes mistakes. What matters is fixing them after." Jack felt a lump in his throat. How to fix mistakes that cost a lifetime of possibilities. How to reclaim lost time and wasted opportunities. "Sometimes we don't know how to fix them," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. The three fell into a silence that was strangely comfortable. Jack helped Ben rebuild his tower of blocks, while Leah watched, occasionally offering suggestions. There was something natural about their interaction, something that transcended the awkwardness of the situation. When the sun started to set, Mrs. Grace called the children inside. It was dinner time and Jack had to leave. "Will you come back?" Ben asked as they gathered the blocks. Jack looked at Mrs. Grace standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but not hostile. "If I'm welcome," he replied carefully. Leah, surprising everyone, including herself, took Jack's hand for a brief moment. "Grandma makes apple pie on Sundays," she said, as if that settled the matter. Jack felt something warm expand in his chest, a sensation long forgotten. "I like apple pie," he answered with a small smile. He said goodbye to the children and to Mrs. Grace, silently promising to return. As he walked back to his car, he felt both lighter and burdened by a new kind of responsibility, the responsibility of connection, the possibility of love. That night, back in his sterile apartment, Jack lay awake for hours, replaying every moment of that visit. Mrs. Grace's guarded reserve, Ben's curiosity, Leah's slowly melting distrust. So many unanswered questions, so many mysteries to unravel about Sarah, about the children, about the past he'd tried to bury. But one thing he knew for sure: he needed to go back. Something about that small town held him. The pain in the children's eyes, the eloquent silence of Mrs. Grace, the simplicity of a world so different from his own. Jack didn't fully understand what he was feeling or what he was seeking. He only knew with a certainty he hadn't felt in years that this visit was just the beginning. Jack's routine had always been a comfort. The alarm precisely at 5:30, strong coffee with no sugar, the impeccable suit, carefully scheduled meetings, decisions based on numbers and projections, gears in a perfectly calibrated machine. For years, that predictability had brought order to chaos, purpose to uncertainty. Now nothing seemed to fit like before. Seated in his office on the top floor of Whitmore Enterprises, Jack stared at his computer screen without really seeing it. The quarterly report, which should have had his full attention, felt distant and meaningless. His hands hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. In the adjacent conference room, muffled voices indicated that the marketing team was already gathered, waiting for him, 15 minutes late, something that had never happened before. "Mr. Whitmore?" his secretary called hesitantly through the half-open door. "Everyone's waiting." Jack nodded automatically, standing up. "I'm on my way." He straightened his tie out of habit, grabbed the folder with printed reports, and walked to the conference room. The conversation ceased when he entered, all eyes turning to the boss who, for the first time in anyone's memory, was late to a meeting. "Good morning, everyone," he said, taking his place at the head of the table. "Let's begin." The meeting proceeded as usual. Presentations, graphs, numbers, strategies. Jack listened, asked questions, made decisions. But there was something different about him, a subtle distraction, a gaze that occasionally drifted to the city view through the window, a hesitation before he spoke. "Mr. Whitmore." The marketing director's voice drew him back. "Do you agree with the new campaign?" Jack refocused on the presentation on screen. Bright images, punchy slogans, promises of exponential growth. Everything he had always valued, everything he had always deemed essential. "It looks impressive," he replied, finding the word tasted strange. "But what's the human impact? How does this affect real people?" A disconcerted silence filled the room. In 10 years of leadership, Jack Whitmore had never asked a question like that. Profits, scalability, return on investment, those were his usual parameters. The director recovered quickly. "Well, our target audience," the meeting went on, but something had changed. A small crack had appeared in Jack Whitmore's polished armor. Returning to his office, he closed the door, another uncharacteristic act, and sat heavily in his chair. On the wall in front of him, a series of awards and recognitions testified to his meteoric rise in the corporate world, unquestionable success by every conventional measure, except one. "She spoke of you with hurt and disappointment." Mrs. Grace's words echoed in his mind like a judge's sentence. There was no anger in her tone, only the statement of an indisputable fact. Sarah, the woman he had loved, had he truly loved her, spoke of him with bitterness, with disappointment. Jack opened a new document on his computer. He began typing, not a report or a memo, but something more personal, more uncertain. What does success mean if... He deleted it, tried again. "Sarah, I never meant..." Deleted again. The words wouldn't come, or maybe they came in excess. disorganized beyond sense. Night after night since visiting that small town, Jack returned to his luxurious apartment, confronting the same oppressive silence, the same emptiness, the same persistent question. That night was no different. He opened the door, set down the folder and jacket on the sofa, and walked to the large window offering a panoramic view of the city. Lights glimmered on distant buildings, other lives, other stories, other choices. Jack poured himself a drink and stayed there, contemplating the city he had conquered, the empire he had built, and the price he had paid. "Am I really such a bad person?" he asked in a low voice, words almost inaudible in the absolute silence of the apartment. The answer didn't come from the starry sky or the city lights. It came from a memory, Ben's eyes, curious and cautious, Leah's gaze, wary yet hopeful, Mrs. Grace's face, lined with time and sacrifice, and then, like a flash, the memory of Sarah. Not the carefree young Sarah from the old photo, but the woman he imagined she had become in those intervening years, raising their children alone, battling cancer, leaving too soon. Jack wasn't a bad person. He was simply a man who had made bad choices, who had prioritized the wrong things, who had let important values slip away. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Jack allowed himself to consider changing. Not just superficial adjustments to his routine or schedule, but a true, deep, meaningful transformation. He picked up his phone and looked at the time. Almost 10 at night. Too late to call Mrs. Grace's house. The children were probably asleep. But it wasn't too late to plan another visit, to take another small step toward those children who, for some inexplicable reason, were pulling him out of his self-imposed isolation. Jack set the untouched drink aside. He opened his computer again, and this time, the words flowed effortlessly. Sunday, 10 a.m. Bring books for the kids. Ask about their interests, their dreams. Listen more, talk less. It was a small start, a cautious approach, a man trying to find his way back to something he hadn't realized he'd lost. As he typed, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope, small and fragile, uncertain but present. Jack's routine had always been a comfort. The alarm at 5:30, strong coffee, impeccable suit, carefully orchestrated meetings, decisions based on data, everything like the gears of a well-oiled machine. For years, that predictability had given him order in chaos, purpose in uncertainty. Now nothing seemed to fit as before, as, sitting in his office at the top floor of Whitmore Enterprises, Jack stared at his computer screen without truly seeing it. The quarterly report he was supposed to focus on seemed distant, insignificant. His hands hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. In the meeting room next door, muffled voices indicated that the marketing team was assembling, waiting for him. 15 minutes late, something that had never happened before. "Mr. Whitmore," his secretary called hesitantly through the half-open door. "They're all waiting." Jack nodded automatically, standing up. "I'm coming." He adjusted his tie out of habit, grabbed the folder with his printed reports, and walked toward the conference room. The conversation stopped when he entered, everyone staring at the boss who, for the first time in the collective memory of the company, was late to a meeting. "Good morning, everyone," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin." The meeting went on as usual, presentations, charts, figures, strategies. Jack listened, asked questions, made decisions. But there was something off, an almost imperceptible distraction, a gaze drifting to the city view through the window, a hesitation in his responses. "Mr. Whitmore," the marketing director's voice pulled him back. "Do you approve of the new campaign?" Jack returned his focus to the presentation on the screen. Vibrant images, punchy slogans, promises of exponential growth. Everything he had always prioritized, everything he had always considered vital. "It looks impressive," he said, finding the word oddly tasteless. "But what's the human impact? How does this affect real people?" A puzzled silence filled the room. Never in a decade of leadership had Jack Whitmore asked such a question. Profits, scalability, return on investment, those were his standard concerns. The director recovered quickly. "Well, our target market..." The meeting continued, but something had shifted. A hairline crack had formed in the perfectly polished armor of Jack Whitmore. When he returned to his office, he closed the door, another uncharacteristic move, and sank into his chair. On the wall facing him, a series of awards and accolades testified to his meteoric rise in the corporate world, unquestionable success by all conventional metrics, except one. "She spoke of you with hurt and disappointment." Mrs. Grace's words echoed again like a judge's decree. No indignation, just the statement of a fact. Sarah, the woman he had loved had he truly loved her, spoke of him with bitterness, with disappointment. Jack opened a new document on his computer. He began typing, this time not a report or memo, but something personal, uncertain. What does success mean if... He deleted it, tried once more. "Sarah, I never meant..." Deleted again. The words refused to come or flooded in disarray, too messy to shape into sense. Night after night since his visit to the small town, Jack had returned to his upscale apartment to confront the same oppressive silence, the same void, the same persistent question. That night was no different. No. He opened the door, dropped his briefcase and jacket on the sofa, and walked to the large window that offered a panoramic view of the city. Distant buildings glowed with light, other lives, other stories, other choices. Jack poured himself a drink and stood there, contemplating the city he had conquered, the empire he had built, and the cost of it all. "Am I such a terrible person?" he asked quietly, the words nearly drowned in the apartment's absolute silence. The answer didn't come from the starry sky or city lights. It came from a memory, Ben's inquisitive, wary gaze, Leah's guarded yet hopeful eyes, Mrs. Grace's face, etched with time and responsibility. Then, in a flash, the memory of Sarah, no longer the carefree young woman from the old photo, but the Sarah he imagined in later years, raising her children alone, fighting cancer, gone too soon. Jack wasn't a bad person, just a man who had made the wrong choices, prioritizing the wrong things, letting crucial values slip away. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he allowed himself to consider real change, not superficial tweaks to his routine or calendar, but a profound, meaningful transformation. He looked again at the city stretching below, the twinkling lights now appearing cold and distant. Somewhere beyond the skyscrapers and congested avenues were Ben and Leah, children who, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, had awakened something long dormant inside him. Jack set his untouched drink aside. He returned to his computer, and this time, words flowed easily, simple and sincere. Books, toys, time. Listen more, talk less. It wasn't an elaborate plan or business strategy. It was just a start, a first tentative step towards something he didn't even realize he wanted, a closer connection to those children who bore fragments of a past he'd tried to forget. The sun was not yet at its peak when Jack parked his car at the entrance of the small town. The modest houses with fading paint and simple gardens gleamed under the golden morning light. There was a tranquility here that sharply contrasted with the frenetic bustle of the business district where he spent most of his days. Jack took a deep breath. After nights of restlessness and reflection, he had made a decision. Visiting the children wasn't enough. He needed to truly spend time with them, to connect. For that, he needed more than words or brief visits. On the passenger seat, a paper bag contained his modest attempt to build that bridge. No flashy packaging or extravagant gifts, just simple toys he had chosen with surprising care even to himself. In the store, he'd spent nearly 2 hours examining each item, trying to imagine what might evoke genuine smiles in those children he barely knew yet who occupied his thoughts. He had chosen a bright ball, some sturdy plastic figures, wooden building blocks, a deck of illustrated cards, and a small kit for making bracelets. Nothing electronic, nothing too expensive, just items that encouraged interaction and creativity. Walking down the dirt road leading to the Williams house, Jack felt an unfamiliar nervousness. Not the measured tension he felt before big negotiations, but something more honest. The anxiety of genuinely wanting to please without hidden agendas. The house looked just as he remembered. Modest down with peeling paint in some spots but immaculately clean, simple flower pots decorating the small porch. In the dirt front yard, Ben was playing alone, drawing shapes in the dust with a stick. When he spotted Jack, the boy froze, eyes widening in surprise. "Ah, you came back," he exclaimed, dropping the stick and running toward him. Something strange happened inside Jack's chest, a warmth that expanded. It was genuine reception, free of expectation or ulterior motive. Just the pure joy of a child seeing someone he considered special for reasons unknown to Jack. "I came back," Jack answered, allowing himself a sincere smile, something he realized had become rare on his usually serious face. Ben's eyes settled on the paper bag Jack carried, his curiosity transparent on his small face. "What's that?" he asked, stepping closer. "Some things for us to play with," Jack replied, feeling oddly vulnerable. "If you and your sister want to, of course." Ben's face lit up like a night sky suddenly filled with fireworks. "Leah," he shouted, turning to the house, "come see who's here." The front door opened, and Leah appeared, followed by Mrs. Grace. The girl maintained her habitual caution, but her eyes couldn't hide the curiosity when she noticed the bag in Jack's hands. "Good morning," Jack greeted, addressing Mrs. Grace first out of respect. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." The older woman studied him for a moment, her face lined by time and worries, betraying little of her thoughts. "The kids were talking about you yesterday," she said finally, "wondering if you'd come back." Jack felt that strange warmth expand further. They had thought of him. They had wondered if he would come back. Mrs. Grace gestured toward the backyard. "Go on out back. I have things to do in the kitchen." It was permission, maybe not warm, but genuine. Jack thanked her with a nod and followed the children, who were already running to the backyard. A simple space with hard-packed dirt, a couple of spindly trees providing scant shade, and an old tire swing suspended from a sturdy branch. "What did you bring?" Leah asked once they reached the yard, her voice striving for indifference but her eyes betraying expectation. Jack set the bag on the ground and began removing the toys one by one. With each revealed item, the children's eyes shone a bit brighter. It wasn't the calculating gleam of someone receiving an expensive gift. It was genuine excitement at discovering new possibilities, new worlds to explore. "A ball," Ben exclaimed, reverently picking up the colorful object. "For us to play together," Jack explained, suddenly unsure. "If you'd like." Ben looked at him as though Jack had just offered him the moon. "Will you play with us?" The question, so simple and direct, hit Jack like a punch to the gut. When was the last time anyone expected something so basic from him? Not his money, not his power, not his influence, just him being there, participating. "That's the plan," he replied honestly. "If you'll have me as a playmate." Leah, examining the colorful plastic figures, lifted her eyes to him. For a moment, Jack saw the same expression he had often seen in Sarah, a mix of distrust and hope, someone who wants to believe but fears disappointment. "Do you even know how to play?" she asked, her small voice direct. The question struck again. Harder this time. Did he know how to play, or to... When was the last time he had simply played with no other purpose than to enjoy the moment? "I think I can relearn," he answered honestly. Ben was already holding the ball, eager. "Let's play catch. I'll show you how." And so began a day Jack would never forget. They started with a simple game of catch, tossing the ball around in an improvised circle. Jack's first attempts were clumsy. His precise movements for signing contracts or managing spreadsheets seemed useless when trying to catch a brightly colored ball tossed by small, enthusiastic hands. "You have to relax your arms," Ben instructed, laughing at Jack's fumbling tries. "Like this?" Jack asked, assuming an exaggeratedly relaxed posture that made the children laugh even harder. "Not that relaxed," Leah exclaimed, allowing herself to join the fun. Jack noticed, with growing surprise, that he was laughing, truly laughing. Not the polite chuckle he offered in social gatherings when someone made a witty remark. It was genuine laughter, rising from his chest and bringing a sense of long-forgotten lightness. After the ball game, they moved on to the plastic figurines. Ben and Leah quickly created a complex world for the little toys, giving them names, personalities, and elaborate storylines. Jack watched, amazed at how they spun rich narratives from the simplest objects. "And this is the Star Captain," Ben explained, holding a blue figurine. "He travels the universe helping people." "And this is the Forest Guardian," Leah added, showing a green figure. "She takes care of the trees and animals." "Who's this one?" Jack asked, pointing to a red figurine that hadn't been assigned a role. The children exchanged glances, as if silently consulting each other. Leah spoke first. "That one can be you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "He helps the other two on their missions." Jack felt a lump in his throat. He picked up the red figurine carefully, as if it were precious. "What's his power?" he asked, joining the game. "He's really smart," Ben suggested. "And strong," Leah added. "But sometimes he forgets to use his strength to help." Jack looked at the girl, struck by the keen insight in her simple words. "Seems he has a lot to learn," he commented gently. Leah nodded, her eyes meeting his fearlessly. "But he's learning now." Morning turned to afternoon as they moved from one game to another. Using the wooden blocks and some yard dirt, they built an elaborate castle with towers, bridges, and moats. Jack, accustomed to leading teams that erected real skyscrapers, found himself completely absorbed in aligning small wooden blocks to form a defensive wall. "It needs to be taller," Ben insisted, "to keep out invaders. And we need a drawbridge here," Leah added, molding the dirt with skilled fingers. Jack, his sleeves rolled up and hands dirty, worked with the intense focus he once reserved for corporate deals. At some point, he realized hours had passed without checking the time, emails or thinking about meetings, deadlines or profits. He was simply there, in the moment, with these children. At some point during a grand battle among the plastic figurines, Jack realized something extraordinary. He was fully present. Not one part of his mind was worried about work, the stock market, pending acquisitions, or future negotiations. There, in that simple backyard with two children who had been strangers just a few weeks before, Jack Whitmore, who had built a corporate empire on cold calculation and relentless drive, was simply playing, laughing, living in the moment. The revelation hit him in the midst of a laugh, prompted by Ben's hilarious imitation of a monster attacking the castle. Jack laughed, truly laughed, without reservation, calculation, concern for appearances or consequences. And in that laughter, he discovered a freedom he hadn't felt since... when? Childhood? Before his father's harsh lessons on weakness and strength? There, with two poor but imaginative children, in that humble space brimming with creativity, Jack found a type of joy he had never experienced in his luxury apartments, private jets, or board meetings. For the first time, he understood, at a visceral level, that being present, truly present, was worth more than all he had ever achieved. When Mrs. Grace appeared with a pitcher of homemade lemonade and simple cups, Jack realized he was genuinely happy. Not the fleeting happiness of closing a big deal or acquiring something expensive, but a deeper contentment, the joy of being alive and connected. "Looks like you're all having fun," Mrs. Grace commented, her gaze taking in the elaborate mud and block castle. "Mr. Whitmore isn't so bad at castle building," Ben said cheerfully. "But he's terrible at catching the ball," Jack laughed, accepting the cup of lemonade she offered. "I have a lot to learn about the truly important skills," he admitted, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Grace. The older woman didn't smile, but her eyes softened a little. "Lunch is ready, kids. Go wash your hands." "Can Mr. Whitmore have lunch with us?" Ben asked hopefully. Mrs. Grace hesitated only for a moment. "If he'd like," she replied. Jack felt the weight of that simple invitation. It was more than a meal. It was a door opening, even if only slightly. "I'd be honored," he answered sincerely. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Jack realized he'd spent the entire day there, playing, laughing, existing in a world without spreadsheets or contracts. "I need to go," he said finally, reluctantly. "It's getting late." The children's disappointment was immediate and genuine. "You'll come back, right?" Ben asked, his voice tinged with anxiety. Jack looked to Mrs. Grace, who observed from the back door. "If I'm welcome," he replied carefully. "Tomorrow?" Ben pressed up, hopeful. Jack hesitated. I can't promise tomorrow, but soon. Very soon. As he said goodbye, Ben impulsively hugged him, a tight hug filled with the emotional intensity only children can show without reserve. Jack, initially surprised, returned the hug, feeling a wave of protectiveness and affection he hadn't expected. Leah, always more reserved, gave a small wave, but much of her initial wariness had faded. It was a start. As Jack walked away, the children ran into the house, their excited voices audible even at a distance. "Grandma! Grandma!" Ben's voice rang clear in the quiet evening. "He brought toys, Grandma. We played with him all day. He stayed with us the whole time." Leah's softer voice chimed in. "It was so much fun." Inside the house, Mrs. Grace listened quietly, watching the brightness in their eyes, the genuine delight in their voices as they recounted every detail of the day. They spoke over one another, interrupting each other in excitement, reliving each game and shared laugh. Mrs. Grace didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted to the window, following Jack's figure as he walked to his car parked near the town entrance. Inside something stirred, an emotion she couldn't fully name. She had never imagined Jack would return, let alone leave the children smiling like that, with such genuine happiness she hadn't seen since before Sarah's illness. Her heart, hardened by years of watching her daughter suffer, months of palliative care, and the sudden responsibility of raising 2 grandchildren alone, felt a slight crack, almost imperceptible, but real. For the first time since learning who that expensive-suited man was, Mrs. Grace allowed herself to consider a possibility she had once entirely rejected. Maybe he had changed. The small town's central square was a modest patch of green among simple houses. An old fountain, long dried up, served as a meeting point for locals. Worn benches formed a semicircle around it, shaded by trees that managed to thrive despite little care. On that Sunday morning, Mrs. Grace watched from a distance as Jack sat on one of those benches, keeping an eye on the twins who ran through the sparse grass, chasing each other in a game only they understood. He'd been back 3 times since that day with the toys, each visit longer than the last. Something about him had changed. Mrs. Grace could see it even from afar. The posture, once rigid and controlled, was now more relaxed. The eyes, once calculating and distant, followed the children's movements with genuine attention, almost a hunger for every detail. It was as though, through them, he was rediscovering something lost long ago. Initially, Mrs. Grace had interpreted his visits as an act of charity or, worse, an attempt to ease old guilt. But watching him now, she saw something different. The way he leaned in to listen to Ben's elaborate stories, how he answered Leah's direct, challenging questions without condescension, how he treated every drawing they gave him as though it were a priceless document. When the children returned home in the late afternoon, tired and happy, Mrs. Grace made a decision, one she had delayed for far too long. "Is he coming again tomorrow?" Ben asked as he washed his hands for dinner, the water rinsing away grass and dirt stains. "I'm not sure," Mrs. Grace replied, studying them closely. "Would you like him to come?" "Yes," Ben exclaimed immediately. "He said he's going to teach me to play real chess." "What about you, Leah?" Mrs. Grace asked her granddaughter, who stayed typically quiet. The girl shrugged, a gesture meant to show indifference, but her bright eyes betrayed her. "He's not as boring as I thought at first," she finally admitted. Mrs. Grace nodded as though that confirmed something important. "I'll call him," she said. "I need to talk to Jack." The next day, Jack arrived earlier than usual. Mrs. Grace waited for him on the porch, sitting in her rocking chair. The children had been sent to a neighbor's house under the pretense of helping with the garden. They needed privacy for this conversation. "Mrs. Williams," Jack greeted her, climbing the porch steps. A question lingered in his eyes, uncertainty about why they were meeting alone. "Grace," she corrected, indicating the chair beside hers. "You can call me Grace." Jack nodded, sitting carefully, as if afraid to break the fragile truce they had established in recent weeks. "Aren't the kids here?" he asked, looking around. "They'll be back soon," Grace answered. "You and I need to talk first." Jack straightened in the chair, bracing himself for something unpleasant. Perhaps she had decided the visits should end, or concluded he wasn't a good influence on the children, or... They came home with shining eyes, Grace said softly, interrupting his thoughts. I don't see that often, not since my daughter passed. Jack said nothing. There was a new vulnerability in her tone, suggesting this wasn't the moment for words but for listening. Grace rocked slowly, the rhythmic creaking of the chair marking the passing seconds, her eyes fixed on a distant point, beyond the yard, beyond the town, maybe beyond time. I've judged you for a long time, she continued, her voice now carrying less hardness. I still judge you sometimes, but maybe I was wrong to think people like you don't change. Jack felt a knot form in his throat. It wasn't the condemnation he expected, but something much harder to face, a chance for redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. The children, he started, but stopped short. What could he say? That he cared about them more than he ever thought possible, that somehow these little people he barely knew had become vital to his life. Grace nodded, as though she heard the unspoken thoughts. She stood with the careful movements of someone carrying old aches in her bones and went inside. Minutes later, she returned with a yellowed envelope, visibly worn by time. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it to Jack. Sarah wrote this years ago, she explained, her voice weighted by memories. She thought about sending it but never found the courage. She was afraid of rejection, afraid you wouldn't want to know. Jack took the envelope with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. His name was written on the front in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, rounded, generous letters, so unlike his own angular script. What is it? He asked, though something inside him already knew. Grace sat back down, her hands now calm in her lap. There was a strange stillness about her, like the quiet before a storm or after one. If you ever read this, Jack, she whispered, know that Leah and Ben are your children. Everything around Jack seemed to freeze. The chirping birds, the creaking rocking chair, the gentle breeze in the trees, all disappeared into an absolute silence. His children. With trembling fingers, he opened the envelope. The letter stretched over several pages, all handwritten, each one bearing witness to the life he hadn't known, the choices he hadn't made, the moments he'd missed. Jack, when you left. The first lines hit him like a punch to the stomach. Sarah wrote with the raw honesty that had always been her hallmark. She described the day she learned of her pregnancy, a few weeks after their separation. The frustrated attempts to contact him, always thwarted by overly efficient secretaries. Her decision to raise the children alone, without pleading for his attention or resources. It wasn't out of pride that I didn't insist. It was out of love for them. I didn't want them growing up feeling like they had to earn their own father's love. As he read each line, Jack's breathing grew more labored. The words were simple, but carried a pain and a hope that spanned years like perfectly aimed arrows. They ask about you sometimes. What should I say? That their father chose another life. That maybe one day he'll look beyond his own reflection and see what he lost. Jack lifted his eyes from the letter, trying to regain control. His vision blurred, and he blinked rapidly, trying to hide it. But it was too late. A tear escaped, then another. He covered his mouth with his hand and inhaled deeply. There was no more hiding, not from what he'd lost or from what he might still rebuild. If you ever read this, it's not to make you feel guilty or regretful. It's only so you know. They exist. They're real. They carry your blood, and sometimes when Ben furrows his brow in concentration, or when Leah challenges the world with that determined look, I see you in them. Grace watched in silence. There was no triumph in her gaze, nor any bitter satisfaction in finally returning an old pain. There was only weariness, and perhaps the first flicker of something that might someday become understanding. Jack said nothing when he finished reading. There were no adequate words for this moment, but his eyes, those eyes that had watched corporate empires rise and fall without betraying any emotion, were now naked, exposed, unable to hide the storm inside. Why now? He finally managed to ask, his voice nearly unrecognizable. Grace sighed, and for the first time since Jack had known her, he saw her full age in her face, the weight of the years and responsibilities. Because they deserve the truth, she replied simply, and because, against all odds, you came back. And stayed. Jack nodded slowly, processing the implications of everything. His children, he had children, those extraordinary kids with their distinct personalities, big dreams despite limited circumstances, they were his. The girl who challenged him with that piercing look, the boy who constructed entire imaginative worlds, his... "Do they know?" he finally asked. Grace shook her head. No, Sarah never told them. I respected her decision. Until now. Late afternoon light cast orange hues across the sky when Grace finally called the children inside. Jack had composed himself again, but something fundamental had changed in him. It was as if a mask he'd worn for so long had finally fallen away, revealing the vulnerable, imperfect man beneath. Ben came in first, running as usual, carrying the energy of a small hurricane. Leah followed more cautiously, her eyes immediately sensing a difference in the atmosphere. "Jack!" Ben exclaimed, ready to launch into another of his elaborate stories. But Grace made a gentle motion for silence. "Come here, children," she said, guiding them into the kitchen, away from Jack. "I need to talk to you for a moment." Jack stayed on the porch, alone with his thoughts, with the weight of the revelations, with the letter that now felt like it was burning in his hands. Through the open window, he could hear snatches of the conversation. "I need to tell you both something." Grace's voice was soft. "Something your mom never had the courage to say." A heavy silence followed, loaded with expectation. "The man who's been visiting, Jack, he's your father." Jack closed his eyes, feeling the impact of those simple words. It was real now, concrete, irreversible. There was no returning to the comfort of ignorance, the safety of a life walled off in glass and steel towers. "Mom wanted to tell you," Grace continued. "She wrote about it. But she was scared he might not care." "Did he know?" came Leah's small but firm voice. "No. He only found out now." Jack opened his eyes, focusing on the distant horizon, how much he had lost, their first steps, first words, the small triumphs, the inevitable tears of childhood, years that would never come back. But maybe there was still time, not to undo the past, but to build something new from here on. Grace's voice again, softer now, almost like a blessing. "Whatever you want to feel, it's okay. But before you decide anything, remember what you told me yesterday. He spent the whole day with you, and it was a happy day." The kitchen door opened. Jack stood up slowly, unsure of what to expect or what he had the right to expect. Ben appeared first, his steps unusually hesitant. His eyes met Jack's, looking for something, confirmation perhaps, or denial. Leah followed, her expression poised in an attempted neutrality, but failing to hide her vulnerability beneath. Jack remained motionless. He desperately wanted to say something, to do something, but feared upsetting the fragile balance of this moment. How could he compensate for years of absence? How could he deserve a title he had never fulfilled? For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence between them held all the words left unsaid, all the questions unanswered, all the missed opportunities. Ben finally broke the impasse. With the direct simplicity of a child, he walked closer and asked, "Is it true? Are you really our dad?" Jack swallowed the knot in his throat. "Yes," he answered quietly. I just found out. But yes, it's true." "Why didn't you come before?" Leah asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to hide it. "I didn't know," Jack said honestly. If I'd known... The words failed him. How to explain that the man he once was probably wouldn't have been a good father, that the revelation might have fallen on deaf ears, unable to comprehend what was being offered. "But you know now," Ben stated, "not a question but a fact." Jack nodded, feeling the weight and responsibility of that knowledge. "Will you keep coming?" Leah asked, her eyes, so much like his own, how had he not noticed it before, fixed on him? That was the crucial question, wasn't it? Not just whether he would come back, but whether he would stay, be constant, present, real in their lives. "If you want me to," he replied sincerely, "I'd really like that." Ben gave a small smile, tentative, hopeful. Leah kept her cautious expression. but Jack could see the longing behind her guarded eyes. There would be no dramatic hugs today, no grand declarations of love. That would have to be built day by day, moment by moment. Trust had to be earned, not assumed. Love needed to grow in ground that was still uncertain. But this was a beginning, a moment of truth after years of absence and ignorance, a door that, once opened, couldn't be shut again. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, stretching long shadows across the simple yard, Jack felt something he hadn't since childhood. The sense that, despite everything, despite mistakes and lost opportunities, there might be a chance to start over, to rediscover through these two extraordinary children the man he might have been, the man he might still become. Wednesday morning dawned with a clear sky and a gentle breeze that stirred the simple curtains in the Williams house. Jack had called the night before, asking Mrs. Grace for permission to take the children on an outing. Nothing extravagant or far, just a walk through town, ice cream, a few hours of his company. She had agreed with a silent nod, her eyes reflecting both caution and hope. At exactly 10, Jack parked his car at the edge of town and walked the rest of the way. Over the last few days since the revelation, he'd learned that displays of wealth impressed no one here, least of all his children. He wore simple clothes now, jeans, a cotton shirt, comfortable sneakers, clothes in which he could run, sit on the ground, or build sandcastles without worry. On the passenger seat of his car, he left his cell phone, turned off. A small revolution for a man who used to sleep with the device on his nightstand. Today there would be no emails, no urgent calls, no outside world demanding his constant attention. Today there were only Ben and Leah and the immense responsibility of starting to be a father after years of absence. As he approached the house, he saw Ben in the front yard, drawing circles in the dirt with a stick. The boy looked up and, upon seeing Jack, broke into a wide smile that lit his face. "Jack!" he exclaimed, running toward him. Halfway there, he paused, as though remembering something important. "I mean, Dad." The word came out hesitant, more of a question than a statement. Jack felt something tremble inside. That single word, Dad, carried a weight he still felt unprepared for. "Jack is fine," he answered gently. "For now." Ben nodded, seeming relieved. Too many changes, too quickly, for all of them. Some things needed time. "Is Leah ready?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice casual, though his heart thudded. Ben ran inside, calling for his sister. Minutes later, both children emerged, followed by Grace. Leah maintained her usual reserve, but her eyes observed Jack with a new intensity, not just curiosity, but assessment, deciding whether he deserved the title he now bore. "Don't come home too late," Grace instructed, handing each child a small hat to protect them from the sun. "And don't wander far from town." "I'll take good care of them," Jack promised, his words carrying significance far beyond that simple outing. Grace nodded, meeting his gaze briefly. There was a silent understanding, an opportunity extended, a responsibility accepted, a future to be attempted. The three set off, walking down the dirt road that led to the town center. Jack carried a small backpack with water, snacks, and tucked away at the bottom, a new colorful ball to replace the worn one Ben cherished so much. "Where are we going?" Leah asked, her voice controlled but not hostile. "I thought we'd go to the playground near the square," Jack replied. "Maybe get some ice cream first. What do you think?" Ben nearly jumped for joy. "Ice cream? Can I get mint chocolate chip?" "You can get any flavor you like," Jack said, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. Son. The word still felt strange in his mind, like a new piece of clothing that hadn't yet molded to his shape. But every day it became more natural, more real. "What about you, Leah? What's your favorite?" he asked, trying to include the quieter twin. Leah shrugged, feigning indifference. "Strawberry," she finally answered, "or vanilla. Either one." "Strawberry, then," Jack smiled. "It's my favorite, too." Something flickered in Leah's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Another small connection. Another invisible thread woven between them. The little ice cream shop in town was simple, offering only 10 flavors and a few plastic tables out front. The owner, a gray-haired man with an easy smile, greeted the kids by name. "And who's this?" he asked, looking at Jack with friendly curiosity. Ben opened his mouth, but Leah spoke first. "This is Jack," she said simply. "Our friend." Jack felt a pang of disappointment, but understood. It was too soon for public declarations, for definitive labels. Friend was a start, more than he deserved, given the past. With cones of ice cream in hand, they walked to the small park. A few swings, a worn slide, and an open grassy area. For children raised in simplicity, it was more than enough. There, as they enjoyed their ice cream, Jack revealed his surprise. "I brought you something," he said, opening the backpack and pulling out the new ball, bright with vibrant colors. Ben's eyes widened. "Is that for us?" "Yes, of course," Jack replied, handing it to the boy. "I thought the other one was getting pretty worn out." Ben took the ball with reverence, as if it were a priceless treasure, rather than a simple toy Jack had bought without a second thought. But Jack was learning that in this world, small gestures held tremendous meaning. "Let's play," Ben suggested, already running to the open space. The next few hours flew by in a blur of laughter, running and improvised games. Jack was amazed at how naturally joy came when he was with the kids. There was no constant pressure to succeed, no need to impress, no mask of perfection he felt compelled to wear in the corporate world. Here, it was enough just to be Jack, to miss a catch, to laugh at his own failed attempts at the slide, to listen to wild stories about imaginary dragons and hidden treasures. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, the three settled under the shade of an old tree to rest. Ben and Leah, flushed from playing, gulped water eagerly. Jack looked at them with a deep affection that grew with each passing day, each hour. It was time, the moment he had planned, feared, and finally accepted as necessary. "Kids," he began, his voice gentler than he intended, "I wanted to tell you something important." Ben and Leah turned to him, alert. Their gazes held a wisdom beyond their years, born from facing loss too soon. Jack took a steadying breath. "I never planned on being a father. I never saw myself that way, but you've changed me." The children listened in silence, absorbing his every word. "I won't promise I'll always get it right," he went on, voice growing steadier. "But I promise I'll try to be the best dad I can be. I hope someday you'll accept me as your father." The words lingered in the air, laden with hope, fear, and possibility. Ben reacted first. A slow, radiant smile spread across his face like a sunrise. There was a simple acceptance there, the child's ability to forgive and move on without carrying the past's burden. Leah remained serious, her eyes, so much like Jack's, studying him intensely. Then, in a gesture that surprised them all, including herself, she leaned in slowly and rested her head against his shoulder. She spoke no words. She didn't need to. That small sign of trust, coming from a daughter who had every reason to doubt him, spoke more than any elaborate speech could. Jack stayed still, afraid to break the fragile moment. His arm wrapped gently around his daughter's shoulders. A soft, almost reverent touch. Ben moved closer on the other side, completing the circle. No one spoke, while the sun painted the sky with orange hues. For Jack, that shared silence, that cautious acceptance, meant more than all the applause he had ever received, all the deals he had ever sealed, all the triumphs he had ever celebrated. It was a mutual promise, a beginning. And for the first time in years, Jack Whitmore allowed himself to believe the best in life might still be ahead. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Jack's office, on the top floor of Whitmore Enterprises, as he gathered his executive team for an extraordinary meeting. In front of him lay neatly organized folders containing documents he'd requested from legal and finance in recent weeks: leases, job title revisions, redistribution of responsibilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack began, his voice calm yet resolute, "in the coming months, we'll be implementing significant changes to the company's operational structure. I'll be reducing my physical presence in this office to 3 days a week, delegating more authority to all of you, and setting up a remote work system for myself." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. In over a decade as CEO, Jack Whitmore had never taken more than a week's vacation. He was known for his constant, almost obsessive presence in the corridors of his company. "There have been important changes in my personal life," he continued, without elaborating, changes that require my presence and attention elsewhere. I trust this team is more than prepared to take on greater responsibilities in my partial absence. The questions then flooded in, concerns about the transition, the impact on investors, rumors of possible health issues that might arise. Jack addressed them all with his usual efficiency, but there was something new in his demeanor, an inner determination that went beyond professional ambition, a clarity of purpose coming from a deeper place. When the meeting ended, his assistant, Margaret, who had worked with him for over 15 years, was the only one brave enough to ask the real question. "It's because of the kids, isn't it? The ones from the photo?" Jack nodded, grateful for her discretion and the absence of judgment in her voice. "My children," he responded simply, "Ben and Leah. I need to be there for them." The following afternoon, Jack parked in front of the Williams house. The autumn sky displayed orange tones that seemed to spill onto the trees around the little town. In the few days since his promise at the park, something had solidified within him, an inner resolve that went beyond words or intentions. Today, he brought more than promises. He brought plans. Grace greeted him on the porch, where the children were playing with the plastic figures he had brought on his second visit. Ben and Leah looked up at him, their faces lighting up in ways as unique as they were, Ben with open excitement, Leah with a softer yet equally real delight. "Hey, Jack!" Ben exclaimed, running over with one of the plastic figures in hand. "Look, I made a new outfit for the Star Captain." Jack admired the colorful scrap of cloth the boy had tied around the blue figure, genuinely complimenting his creativity. Leah approached more slowly, holding out a drawing in her hand without speaking. "It's beautiful, Leah," Jack said, observing what looked like a house surrounded by trees and flowers, with 3 small figures out front. "You draw really well." A brief smile flickered across the girl's face before she returned to her usual air of studied caution. "Mrs. Williams," Jack turned to Grace, "I'd like to speak with you. Privately, if possible." Grace nodded, indicating the rocking chairs on the porch. "Kids, keep playing. I'll talk to Jack for a moment." Once seated, a safe distance from the children's listening ears, Jack went straight to the point. "I want to be more involved in their lives, not just occasional visits or weekend outings. I want real, concrete responsibility." Grace studied his face for a long time, as if searching for any sign of hesitation or doubt. She found none. "How do you plan to do that, living 40 minutes away with a job that consumes your life?" "I found a house to rent," Jack replied, a decision made just 2 days earlier, after countless sleepless nights. 3 blocks from here. It's not as big as my apartment, but it's roomy enough for the 3 of us. It has a decent yard, 3 bedrooms, and it's 10 minutes from the local elementary school." Grace raised her eyebrows, clearly surprised by how quickly and concretely Jack was moving forward. "You're talking about moving here completely?" Jack nodded. "For the time being, I'll split my schedule. 3 days in the city for meetings I can't postpone, and the rest of the week here. Eventually, I'll reorganize the company so I can work primarily from home." "And the children? Are you talking about taking them away from here?" There was a new tension in Grace's voice, understandable for someone who had been the only stability in her grandchildren's lives since their mother's passing. "Not without your approval," Jack hurried to clarify, "and not permanently. I was thinking of a gradual arrangement. For the first few months, they'd still live with you, but spend time at the new house with me, maybe starting with a few afternoons a week, then occasional nights, weekends, whatever pace is comfortable for everyone." Grace rocked slowly, her eyes now on the small vegetable garden in the front yard. "And what happens when you get tired of this arrangement?" she asked finally. "When you realize kids aren't projects you can abandon when they become inconvenient? When work calls? When emergencies arise? When the novelty wears off?" The question cut Jack like a knife, but he recognized its legitimacy. What guarantees could he offer a woman who had watched her daughter raise 2 kids alone after he left? "Mrs. Williams, Grace," he corrected, choosing his words carefully. "I can't undo the past. I can't go back and be the man Sarah needed me to be, but I can be the father Leah and Ben need right now. I promise you, with all sincerity, I will not abandon them again." He paused, then continued, "I know my words may sound empty, given the history. That's why I want to act, not just talk. The house is already rented. I've started reorganizing the company. I've checked out local schools." Another moment of hesitation. Then, "I want to give them what they deserve: education, stability, opportunities, and most importantly, my presence." Grace kept rocking, the rhythmic creak of the chair filling the silence between them. "Sarah once said you could be very convincing when you wanted something," she said at last, offering a small, humorless smile. "This time I'm not trying to convince," Jack replied. "I'm just telling the truth. I need to do this right, for them, for Sarah, for myself." Another long silence followed. Grace watched the children playing in the yard, their faces serious as they discussed some crucial element of their imaginary story. "They miss you when you're not here," she said softly. "Ben talks about you constantly. Even Leah, so reserved, peeks out the window around the time you usually arrive." Jack felt guilt mingled with a strange happiness. It felt good to be wanted, to be needed. "This isn't just my decision," Grace continued. "We'll ask them, explain what you propose, hear what they have to say." Jack nodded, thankful for the wisdom of a woman who, despite having every reason to resent him, cared only for her grandchildren's well-being. In the weeks that followed, Jack plunged into a brand new routine. The rented house, a 2-story place with wide windows and a good-sized yard, was quickly furnished with the basics. Nothing ostentatious, nothing like the cold luxury of his city apartment. Every piece was chosen for comfort and functionality. Soft couches where kids could sprawl with books, a large wooden table where they could do homework, comfortable beds with colorful quilts. In the children's bedrooms, Jack left the walls partly empty so they could decorate them as they wished. Ben's room had only a brightly colored world map and a shelf with a few adventure books. Leah's had a small shelf for books and a mobile of stars hanging from the ceiling. The transition was gradual, as agreed. In the first weeks, the children came for lunch, returning to Grace's house before dark. Then they started spending entire afternoons, doing homework at the new dining table, playing in the yard, helping or gleefully hindering Jack in the kitchen. For someone whose diet had consisted mostly of takeout from upscale restaurants or meals prepared by his housekeeper, cooking became a fascinating challenge. Jack watched online videos of simple recipes, making hilarious mistakes that caused the twins to laugh until they were breathless. "That's not how you make pancakes, Jack," Ben exclaimed one Saturday morning, watching in horror as Jack tried to flip a shapeless, half-raw blob in the skillet. Jack pretended offense. "What do you mean?" "This is a perfectly executed pancake." "It looks more like a swamp monster," Leah observed dryly, prompting another wave of laughter. These moments, simple, domestic, often clumsy, became Jack's favorites. At the company, he was known for near-obsessive perfectionism, for zero tolerance of mistakes. Here, in the improvised kitchen of the new house, he discovered the joy of failing, laughing at himself, and learning from kids who had no fear of pointing out his errors. By the second month, Jack enrolled the children in the local elementary school. The older, more distant school with fewer resources was replaced by a smaller but better equipped one, where the kids received individualized attention. He set a strict routine for himself, waking early, making breakfast, driving the kids to school, working remotely during class hours, and being at the gate right when they got out. That first week, the other parents eyed him curiously. This new man, who obviously wasn't from around there, clearly out of place in his pricey jeans and sweaters that tried to look casual but screamed executive on break. Over time, though, he became just another familiar face, another adult carrying bright backpacks and listening to excited stories about the school day. At home, he converted a spare room into an office, from where he managed his business through video calls and emails. His associates noticed the change, not just in location, but in Jack himself. There was a new quality to his decisions, less cold, more mindful of human impact. Gradually, the children started spending nights at the new house. Initially just once a week, always Fridays, so they wouldn't have to wake early for school the next day. Jack turned those nights into little celebrations, not with extravagant gifts, but with simple rituals: popcorn and movies, pillow fort building, flashlight storytelling under the blankets. Leah remained more reserved than Ben, but Jack had learned to read the subtle signs of her slowly growing acceptance, the way she left favorite books at his house, how she'd begun calling her room my room instead of the room where I sometimes sleep, and how she occasionally sat next to him on the couch during movies. Close enough, but not too close. Grace came for dinner once a week, observing the interaction between Jack and the children with watchful eyes. Her visit served both as supervision and support, making sure everything was fine, offering quiet advice, while also giving Jack space to build his own relationship with his kids. "How you're doing well," she commented one night, as Jack washed dishes and the kids drew pictures at the dining table. "Better than I expected, to be honest." Jack smiled, recognizing the difficulty of this compliment from a woman who had every reason to doubt him. "I'm trying," he replied simply. Grace nodded. "That's what counts in the end, keeping on trying even when it's hard." One afternoon, after 4 months of this new life, Jack waited by the school gate as usual. He watched the kids trickle out in excited groups, searching for the familiar faces of his two. He spotted Ben first, racing ahead as he always did, his backpack bouncing awkwardly on his small shoulders. "Dad, wait up," the boy shouted, waving wildly. Jack froze just for a second. That word Dad hit him like lightning. It was a title he still felt he hadn't fully earned, but one he strove toward every day. Leah followed behind, walking at her more measured pace. When she reached him, she said nothing but held out her hand for his. A simple gesture, almost casual, yet laden with significance that made Jack's throat tighten with emotion. He tried to keep his composure, but it was futile. Tears came, silent yet impossible to hold back. They weren't sad tears, but a kind of joy he had never known, deep, genuine, free of the complications that had always accompanied his successes. "Why are you crying, Dad?" Ben asked, confused. Jack smiled through the tears, unable to fully explain. "Sometimes people cry when they're really happy," he managed to say. Leah, ever perceptive, squeezed his hand a bit tighter. "It's because Ben called you Dad in public," she stated simply. "Right." Jack looked at her, startled by her insight. "Partly," he admitted. "And because you're holding my hand." Leah considered this a moment, then shrugged with feigned indifference. "It's no big deal," she said, but she didn't let go of his hand. That night, after the children were in bed, Jack lingered in the modest living room of the new house, gazing at the photographs on the shelf. On one side, the old photo of him and Sarah, young and smiling, from a time that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. On the other side, a recent picture, he and the twins at the town park, all three smiling at the camera Grace held, past and present, side by side. The woman he had loved and lost, the children he had almost never known, the second chance he never imagined he would get. The man who had built a corporate empire through emotional distance and cold calculation now found meaning in simple tasks, helping with homework, telling bedtime stories, preparing snacks for the next day, listening to elaborate theories about dinosaurs, or detailed explanations of Leah's latest drawings. Jack Whitmore, the Iceman's, had changed, and in that moment, seated in the modest living room of a home in a small town he hadn't known until a few months ago, he realized a truth many never grasp their entire lives. He would never be alone again. Not because love guarantees anything, it doesn't. Not because life promises happy endings, it doesn't. But because he had chosen to be present, fully, wholeheartedly present, with all the imperfections and uncertainties that entailed. The next morning, when Leah shuffled into the kitchen, still groggy from sleep, she saw Jack making pancakes, finally recognizable as such, and said without fanfare, "I think I'll start calling you Dad too. If you don't mind." Jack nearly dropped the spatula. I wouldn't mind at all," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Leah nodded, as though finalizing an important deal. "Okay," she said simply, "because it would be weird for Ben to be the only one." And with that, she sat down and began eating her pancakes, as if she hadn't just turned Jack's world upside down. Maybe that was how truly important things happened, Jack thought, not with grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through small, everyday acts and simple decisions made between bites of pancake. And in that presence, he finally found what success had never given him, a place to call home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.